The music stopped, and the crowd's chatter fell to a suffocating hush. Lieutenant James Carter, in his pristine army dress uniform, stood frozen as his uncle's voice boomed across the wedding reception. "No nephew of mine will shame this family with his choices." The word landed like a grenade, and James's heart plummeted, the weight of 100 judgmental stares pinning him to the Tennessee soil. He had known coming back to his small hometown of Willow Creek would be a gamble. After 10 years of service-due tours in Afghanistan, a Purple Heart, and a chest full of medals, she thought he'd earned a hero's welcome. But here, at his cousin Sarah's wedding, the air was thick with the same prejudice he'd fled at 18. James gripped his champagne flute, his knuckles whitening, as Evan, his partner, leaned closer, whispering, "You don't have to stay." Evan's hazel eyes, steady and warm, were James's anchor in the storm. But leaving wasn't an option, not when family was all he had left after the war. The reception was held in a sprawling barn, its rafters strung with fairy lights that cast a golden glow over linen-draped tables. Sarah, radiant in her lace gown, had begged James to attend, promising a new chapter for their fractured family. He believed her, driven by a flicker of hope that his service might bridge the gap his identity had widened. Yet now, as his uncle, a barrel-chested man with a preacher's zeal, pointed a trembling finger at him, James felt the old wounds reopen. "You think you can parade your lifestyle here?" His uncle spat, the word lifestyle dripping with venom. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others averting their eyes. Evan, ever the peacemaker, squeezed James's hand under the table. At 30, Evan was a high school history teacher with a quiet strength that had drawn James in 3 years ago at a veterans support group in Nashville. Their relationship had been a lifeline. Late night talks about loss, love, and the courage to live openly. But Willow Creek wasn't Nashville, and James could feel the town's judgment closing in like a noose. He stood, his 6-foot frame rigid, and said, "I'm here for Sarah, not to fight." His voice was steady, but inside, he was unraveling. The groom, Captain Ryan Thompson, Sarah's fiancé and a fellow Army officer, watched from the head table, his expression unreadable. Ryan and James had served together years ago, their bond forged in the chaos of war. But Ryan's silence now felt like a betrayal. James had come out to him during a sleepless night in Kandahar, expecting rejection but receiving a nod and a quiet, "Doesn't change who you are." Yet here, in this moment, Ryan's neutrality stung worse than his uncle's words. As the evening wore on, the tension simmered. James and Evan danced once, a slow sway to a country ballad, but the whispers followed them. "Disgrace," someone muttered. "Shouldn't be allowed in uniform," another hissed. James's jaw clenched, but Evan's touch kept him grounded. "They don't know you," Evan murmured, his voice a lifeline. Still, the weight of being the outsider in his own family pressed harder. He'd faced enemy fire, but this rejection from blood cut deeper. Sarah approached, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, James," she whispered, clutching his arm. "I didn't know it'd be like this." Her sincerity was real, but it couldn't erase the humiliation. James forced a smile, not wanting to ruin her day. "It's okay, Sarah. I'm fine." But he wasn't. The barn felt smaller, the air thicker, and every glance felt like a judgment. By the time the toasts began, James was ready to leave. He and Evan were halfway to the door when Ryan stood, tapping his glass for silence. The crowd turned, expectant, as the groom, still in his dress blues, raised his glass. "To family," he began, his voice steady but charged with something James couldn't place. "And to those who fight for it in the battlefield and at home." His eyes locked on James. And for the first time that night, James felt seen. Ryan's next words would change everything. But in that moment, James didn't know it. All he knew was the ache in his chest and the man beside him, holding his hand against the world. Ryan's voice carried over the crowd, each word deliberate, like a soldier choosing his ground. "Some of you know James Carter," he said, his gaze sweeping the barn before settling back on James. "He saved my life in Afghanistan. Took shrapnel meant for me." A murmur rippled through the guests, some faces softening, others hardening. James froze, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected this nod from Ryan, who'd been silent all night. The barn was a sea of conflicting emotions. James's uncle, still red-faced from his outburst, crossed his arms, his lips a thin line. Sarah clutched Ryan's hand, her eyes darting between her husband and her cousin. Evan's grip on James's arm tightened. A silent question, what's he doing? James didn't know, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As Ryan continued, "James carried me 2 miles through a war zone, bleeding out, to a medevac chopper," Ryan said, his voice cracking slightly. "He didn't ask for glory, didn't ask for your approval. He just did his job." The room was silent now, the weight of Ryan's words sinking in. James felt exposed, his scars both visible and not laid bare. He'd never spoken of that day, not even to Evan. It was just another mission, another life saved. But Ryan was turning it into something more. The groom stepped down from the head table, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. He approached James, who stood rooted near the exit, Evan at his side. "You think this man's less of a soldier because of who he loves?" Ryan's voice rose, challenging now. "You think he's less of a man?" He turned to the crowd, his eyes blazing. "I'm alive because of him, and I'm ashamed of anyone who'd spit on that." A few guests clapped hesitantly, but James's uncle stood, his chair scraping loudly. "This ain't about his service," he bellowed. "It's about sin, about what's right in God's eyes." The room erupted in murmurs, some nodding, others shaking their heads. James felt the old anger flare years of sermons, of being told he was broken, flooded back. He wanted to shout, to fight, but Evan's steady presence kept him still. Ryan didn't flinch. "God," he said, turning to the uncle. "I've seen what James has been through. If God's got a problem with him, he's not the God I know." The words hung heavy, and for a moment, even the uncle faltered. Sarah, tears streaming now, stepped forward. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my wedding. James is my family. If you can't respect that, leave." The ultimatum stunned the room. James's chest tightened. Sarah, the little cousin he'd once carried on his shoulders, was fighting for him. But the uncle wasn't done. "You're all blinded," he spat, storming toward the door, a few relatives trailing him. The barn felt split, half the guests staying, half whispering their dissent. James wanted to disappear, to shield Evan from this ugliness. But Evan's hand never left his. Ryan turned back to James, his expression softening. "I should have spoken up sooner," he said quietly. "I owed you that." James nodded, unable to find words. The weight of Ryan's support was a lifeline, but the wounds from his family's rejection still bled. Evan, sensing his struggle, leaned in. "You're enough," he whispered. "You've always been enough." As the reception resumed, the mood was fragile, like a ceasefire after a battle. James and Evan returned to their table, but the whispers lingered. A few relatives approached, offering awkward apologies or small talk, but others kept their distance. James felt the divide his service honored, his identity condemned. He wondered if Willow Creek could ever be home again. Later, as the stars emerged over the Tennessee hills, James and Evan stepped outside for air. The fairy lights glowed softly, and the distant music felt like a world away. "I'm proud of you," Evan said, his voice steady. "For showing up. For being you." James looked at him, the man who'd chosen him despite the cost, and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe love was its own kind of victory. But the night wasn't over, and the truth Ryan had begun to expose was only the start. Something bigger was coming, something that would force James to confront his past and fight for his future. The night air was cool, a stark contrast to the stifling tension inside the barn. James leaned against the wooden fence, staring at the rolling hills that stretched into the darkness. Evan stood beside him, his shoulder brushing James's, a quiet reminder of their shared strength. "You okay?" Evan asked, his voice soft but searching. James exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp Tennessee night. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought I was ready for this." He'd faced worse than his uncle's words, bullets, bombs, the screams of men he couldn't save. But this was different. This was home, or what was supposed to be home. Willow Creek had been his refuge as a kid, a place of fishing trips with his dad and Sunday dinners with Sarah's family. Now, it felt like enemy territory. The rejection wasn't just personal. It was a betrayal of everything he'd fought for. Evan reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he said. "You're here. That's enough." James wanted to believe him, but the sting of his uncle's words lingered, echoing the sermons he'd heard growing up. "You're broken. You're wrong." He'd spent years building a life beyond those voices. But tonight, they'd found him again. Inside, the reception continued, the music swelling as guests danced under the fairy lights. Sarah appeared at the barn door, her silhouette framed by the warm glow. "James," she called, her voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" He nodded, and Evan gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before letting go. Sarah approached, her wedding dress trailing slightly in the grass. "I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes red from crying. "I didn't know Uncle Ray would. I thought things had changed." James forced a smile. "It's not your fault, Sarah. You warned me it might be rough." She shook her head, her curls bouncing. "No, it's not okay. You're my hero, James. Always have been. I don't care who you love." Her words were a balm, but they couldn't erase the night's wounds. "Ryan feels awful," she added. "He wants to make this right." Before James could respond, Ryan stepped outside, his dress blues catching the moonlight. "James," he said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "I froze in there. I should have shut Ray down the second he opened his mouth." James studied him, the man he'd once called a brother in arms. Ryan's broad shoulders and steady gaze hadn't changed since Afghanistan. But there was a vulnerability now that James hadn't seen before. "You said enough," James replied, his tone guarded. "More than I expected." Ryan shook his head. "Not enough. Not after what you did for me." He paused, his jaw tightening. "There's something else you need to know. About why Ray's got it out for you." James's stomach twisted. He'd always sensed his uncle's disapproval ran deeper than religious dogma, but he'd never dug into it. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Ryan glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "Your dad," Ryan began. "Before he passed, he and Ray had a falling out. Over you." James's breath caught. His father, a quiet man who died of cancer when James was 20, had never spoken of it. "Ray wanted to send you to one of those conversion camps." Ryan continued. "Your dad refused. Said he'd disown Ray if he ever brought it up again." Ray's been carrying that grudge ever since. The revelation hit James like a punch. His father had known and chosen him. The memory of his dad's quiet pride at his enlistment, his gentle hugs, took on new weight. Tears pricked James's eyes, and Evan's hand found his shoulder. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" James asked, his voice raw. Sarah stepped closer. "Mom told me last year. She said Dad wanted to protect you. He thought you'd be better off not knowing." The weight of his father's love settled over James, both comforting and crushing. He'd spent years believing he'd disappointed his family, but his dad had fought for him in silence. The thought gave him strength, but it also fueled his anger. Ray's hatred wasn't just about belief, it was personal, a vendetta rooted in a family secret. As they stood there, the barn door opened again, and a young woman, James's cousin Emily, barely 20, approached. "James," she said, her voice trembling. I want you to know I'm on your side. I don't care what Uncle Ray says." Her defiance, small but fierce, sparked something in James. Maybe not everyone in Willow Creek was lost to him. The night was far from over, and the truth Ryan had unearthed was only the beginning. James felt a shift inside him, a resolve to face whatever came next. Not just for himself, but for Evan, for Sarah, and for the family he still believed in. The revelation about his father lingered in James's mind like a melody he couldn't shake. He sat with Evan on a bench outside the barn, the distant hum of music mingling with the cricket's song. The fairy lights cast a soft glow, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold knot in his chest. His dad had fought for him, had stood against Ray's cruelty, and James had never known. The thought was a lifeline, but it also sharpened his resolve to confront the past head-on. Evan, sensing the shift in James, rested a hand on his knee. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice steady as always. "Whatever you decide to do, I'm here." James looked at him, the man who'd chosen to stand by him through every storm. Evan's hazel eyes held a quiet strength, a promise that no matter how ugly this night became, they'd face it together. James nodded, squeezing Evan's hand. "I need to talk to Ray," he said finally. "I need to know why." Inside, the reception had settled into a fragile normalcy. Guests danced, laughed, and clinked glasses, but the undercurrent of tension remained. James spotted his uncle near the bar, surrounded by a small group of relatives who shared his views. Their heads were bent together, their voices low but sharp. James's pulse quickened, but he straightened, his military training kicking in. This wasn't a battlefield, but it felt like one. Sarah intercepted him as he approached. "James, are you sure?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "He's not worth it." James met her gaze. "I need to do this. For Dad. For me." She hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. Evan followed close behind, a silent pillar of support. As James neared the group, Ray's eyes locked onto his, narrowing with disdain. "Come to cause more trouble?" Ray asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "No," James said, his tone calm but firm. "I came to understand. Why do you hate me so much?" The question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. The group around Ray fell silent, their eyes darting between uncle and nephew. Ray's face reddened, but he didn't back down. "You know why?" he said. "You're living in sin. You're a disgrace to this family." James's jaw tightened, but he pressed on. "Dad didn't think so. He stood up to you. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ray's expression faltered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he masked it with anger. "Your father was weak. He spat. He let you run wild. Let you become this." The word was a weapon, but James didn't flinch. "He loved me," James said, his voice steady. And I'm starting to think that's what you can't stand. The crowd around them grew. Guests drawn by the rising tension. Ryan appeared at James's side. His presence a quiet warning to Ray. That's enough, Ryan said, his voice low but commanding. You don't get to rewrite history. James's dad was a better man than you'll ever be. Ray's face twisted. But before he could respond, Emily, the young cousin, stepped forward. Uncle Ray, stop it, she said, her voice shaking but clear. James's family. You don't get to decide who belongs. Her words, small but fierce, shifted something in the room. A few guests nodded, their expressions softening. Others, still loyal to Ray, muttered their dissent. But the tide was turning. James felt a surge of gratitude for Emily, for Ryan, for Sarah, for the family who chose him. But Ray wasn't done. You'll all regret this, he said, his voice low and venomous. This ain't over. He turned and stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. As the night wore on, James and Evan found a quiet corner, the weight of the confrontation settling over them. You were incredible, Evan said, his voice warm with pride. James shook his head. I needed to know. For Dad. Evan pulled him close. And for a moment, the world was just the two of them, their love a shield against the chaos. But Ray's parting words echoed in James's mind. This wasn't over. Something darker was brewing. And James knew he'd have to face it, not just for himself, but for the family he was rebuilding, piece by piece. The barn's warmth faded as James and Evan stepped back into the night. The stars above Willow Creek sharp against the inky sky. Ray's words, "This ain't over," hung like a storm cloud, promising trouble James couldn't yet see. He'd faced down enemies in war. But this was different. This was family, fractured and raw, and the stakes felt higher than any battlefield. Evan, sensing James's unease, slipped an arm around his waist. You stood your ground, he said softly. That's more than most would do. James leaned into him, drawing strength from Evan's steady presence. I don't know if it was enough, he murmured. Ray's not the type to let this go. Evan's brow furrowed, but he didn't press. Instead, he kissed James's temple, a quiet promise that they'd face whatever came together. Inside, the reception was winding down, guests trickling out into the night. Sarah and Ryan approached, their faces a mix of exhaustion and resolve. We're heading to the hotel, Sarah said, her voice tired but warm. You two should come with us. Get away from all this. James hesitated, glancing at the barn where his uncle's allies still lingered, their whispers like daggers. Maybe you're right, he said finally. But I need to know what Ray's planning. Ryan's jaw tightened. I've got a bad feeling about him, he admitted. He's been talking to some of the older folks, stirring things up. I heard him mention a family meeting tomorrow. James's stomach dropped. A family meeting in Willow Creek usually meant one thing, a reckoning. Ray was rallying his allies, likely to push James out for good. I'm not running, James said, his voice firm. Not this time. The next morning, James and Evan drove to Sarah's childhood home, a white clapboard house on the edge of town. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle, but the nostalgia was tainted by dread. Ray had called the meeting at noon, and James knew it was a trap. Still, he couldn't walk away, not when his father's memory was at stake. Evan, ever his anchor, stayed close, his presence a reminder that James wasn't alone. The living room was crowded with relatives, their faces a mix of curiosity and hostility. Ray stood at the front, his Bible in hand like a weapon. We're here to talk about family, he began, his voice booming, and what it means to honor it. His eyes locked on James, who stood at the back with Evan. Some of us have strayed, brought shame on this house. It's time to set things right. James's pulse quickened, but he stepped forward, his military bearing intact. If you've got something to say, Ray, say it to me. The room stilled, every eye on them. Ray's lip curled. You're not welcome here, he said. Not with him. He gestured at Evan, who stiffened but didn't flinch. You want to talk about shame? James countered, his voice steady. You tried to send me to a camp to fix me. Dad stopped you. That's the real shame here. A gasp rippled through the room. Some relatives looked shocked, others skeptical. Ray's face darkened. Lies. He spat. Your father was weak. And you're worse. But Emily, the young cousin, stood up. Stop it, Uncle Ray, she said, her voice trembling but fierce. James is a hero. You're the one tearing us apart. Her words sparked murmurs, and James saw cracks in Ray's armor, some relatives shifting uncomfortably, others nodding at Emily. Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear. This family is bigger than your hate. Ray. James stays. Ryan joined her, his presence commanding. You don't speak for all of us, he said. James does. The room was divided, but the tide was turning. James felt a surge of hope, tempered by the knowledge that Ray wouldn't back down easily. As the meeting dissolved into heated arguments, James and Evan slipped outside, the weight of the confrontation heavy but not crushing. You were incredible, Evan said, pulling James close. I'm trying, James replied, his voice raw. For us. But Ray's parting glare told him the fight was far from over, and the truth was still unfolding. The sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway as James and Evan stood outside Sarah's house. The family meeting had left James drained but resolute. Ray's venom had exposed the fault lines in their family, but Emily's courage and Sarah's loyalty had given him something to hold on to. Still, the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Ray's parting words, "You'll see what happens when you defy God's will," echoed in James's mind, a threat he couldn't ignore. Evan leaned against their rental car, his hazel eyes searching James's face. You don't have to keep fighting this alone, he said, his voice gentle but firm. We can leave. Go back to Nashville. Build our life there. James wanted to agree, to escape the suffocating weight of Willow Creek. But something held him back. If I run now, he said, Ray wins, and I'm done letting him define me. Their conversation was cut short by the crunch of tires on gravel. A pickup truck pulled up, and Ryan stepped out, his face grim. We've got a problem, he said, glancing at James. Ray's been talking to the local veterans group. He's trying to get them to publicly denounce using you're dishonoring the uniform. James's blood ran cold. His service was his pride, the one thing no one could take from him. To have it twisted like this was a blow he hadn't seen coming. They can't do that, Evan said, his voice sharp with anger. James earned every medal he's got. Ryan nodded, but his expression was troubled. Most of the group respects James, but Ray's got influence. He's framing it as a moral issue, not service. They're meeting tonight at the VFW hall. James's fists clenched. Then I'm going, he said. I'm not letting him rewrite my story. The VFW hall was a squat brick building on the edge of town, its walls lined with faded photos of local veterans. By the time James, Evan, and Ryan arrived, the room was packed men and women in flannel and camo, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Ray stood at the front, his voice booming as he recounted James's sins, twisting his service into a narrative of shame. This man parades his lifestyle in front of our children. Ray said, his eyes glinting. He's no hero. James stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice steady. I'm Lieutenant James Carter. He began, his military bearing silencing the room. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I carried my brothers to safety, took shrapnel to save lives. If that's not enough for you, then tell me what is. The room was quiet, some faces softening, others still hard. Evan stood at his side, his presence a quiet strength. Ryan spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of command. I was one of those brothers. He said, James saved my life. If you're questioning his honor, you're questioning mine. Murmurs spread, and James saw doubt flicker in the crowd. Then, an older veteran, grizzled and weathered, stood. I don't care who you love, son, he said to James. You served. That's enough for me. Others nodded, and the tide began to turn. Ray's face twisted with frustration, but he pressed on, quoting scripture and rallying his supporters. But the room was shifting, the veterans' respect for James's service outweighing Ray's rhetoric. Emily, who'd slipped in quietly, stood and spoke, her voice clear. My cousin's a hero, she said. You don't get to take that from him. Her words, simple but fierce, sparked applause, and Ray's influence began to crumble. As the meeting ended, James felt a weight lift, but the victory was bittersweet. Ray's campaign had exposed the town's divisions, and James knew some wounds would never heal. Outside, Evan pulled him into a hug. You did it, he whispered. You showed them who you are. James nodded, but Ray's final glare told him the fight wasn't over. Something bigger was coming, and James would need all his strength to face it. The VFW Hall victory was a turning point, but James knew Ray wouldn't surrender easily. The next morning, he and Evan sat at a diner in Willow Creek, the smell of coffee and bacon grounding them in the quiet hum of small-town life. The weight of the past 2 days pressed on James, but Evan's steady gaze across the table kept him anchored. You're stronger than you know, Evan said, his voice warm. You faced them down last night. That's no small thing. James stirred his coffee, his thoughts swirling. It's not enough, he said. Ray's not just fighting me, he's fighting what I stand for. If I don't stop him, he'll keep hurting people like us. Evan reached for his hand, their fingers brushing under the table. Then we stop him, he said simply. Together. James nodded, a flicker of resolve igniting. He'd spent years running from this town's judgment. Now, it was time to fight back. Sarah called as they finished breakfast, her voice tense. Ray's planning something at the church tonight, she said. He's calling it a community prayer to save the town's soul. It's about you, James. The news hit hard. Ray was escalating, using the church Willow Creek's hard to rally his allies. James knew this was more than a personal vendetta. It was a public challenge to his place in the community. That evening, the church was packed, its pews filled with familiar faces, some supportive, others hostile. Ray stood at the pulpit, his Bible raised like a shield. We're here to protect our values, he declared, his eyes locking on James, who sat near the back with Evan, Sarah, and Ryan. This town won't bow to sin. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. James felt the weight of their stares, but he stood, his voice cutting through the tension. I'm not here to fight your faith, James said, his tone steady. I'm here to live mine. I serve this country, bled for it. I love a good man, and I'm not ashamed. Evan's hand found his, a quiet anchor. The room stilled, Ray's face darkening. But before he could respond, Emily stood, her voice ringing out. James's family, she said. And this town's better because of him. Her courage sparked others, Sarah, Ryan, and even the grizzled veteran from the VFW, who stood and nodded. Ray's sermon faltered as more voices joined in. Stories of James's kindness, his service, his heart. The church, meant to be Ray's stronghold, became a battleground of ideas. A young woman, a friend of Emily's, spoke up. "My brother's gay," she said, tears in her eyes. "If James can stand up, so can we." The tide was turning, and Ray's influence was slipping. Desperate, Ray doubled down, quoting scripture and warning of divine judgment. But his words rang hollow against the growing chorus of support. Ryan stepped forward, his voice commanding. "This isn't about God," he said. "It's about fear. And James has more courage than you'll ever know." The crowd erupted in applause, and Ray's face twisted with defeat. As the meeting ended, James felt a shift. The town wasn't fully his, but it was no longer fully Ray's either. Outside, under the church's stained glass glow, Evan pulled him close. "You changed something tonight," he said. "You gave people hope." James kissed him, unashamed, as the stars watched. But Ray's silence as he left the church was ominous, a signal that one final battle loomed. The morning after the church meeting, Willow Creek felt different, not healed, but cracked open, like a seed ready to grow. James and Evan stood on Sarah's porch, the dawn light painting the hills gold. The fight with Ray had left James raw but resolute. He'd faced his uncle's hate, the town's judgment, and his own fears, and he was still standing. Evan's hand in his was a reminder of why. Sarah and Ryan joined them, coffee mugs in hand. "You shook things up last night," Sarah said, her smile tired but proud. "People are really talking. About change." Ryan nodded. "Ray's losing ground. But he's not done. I heard he's planning to confront you at the town square today." James's jaw tightened. The square was Willow Creek's heart, where every major event unfolded. If Ray wanted a final stand, he'd chosen the perfect stage. By noon, the square was crowded. Townsfolk gathered under the old oak tree where a makeshift podium stood. Ray was there, his face grim, flanked by his loyalists. James, Evan, Sarah, Ryan, and Emily approached together, a united front. The air was thick with anticipation, the crowd a mix of supporters and skeptics. Ray raised his voice, his words sharp. "This town stands for family, for faith," he said. "James Carter defies both. He doesn't belong here." James stepped forward, his heart steady despite the weight of Ray's words. "I'm not here to tear anything down," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "I'm here to build something better. I love this town. I love my family. And I love Evan." He took Evan's hand, unashamed, and the crowd murmured, some with shock, others with warmth. "If that's not enough for you, that's your choice. But I'm not going anywhere." Emily spoke next, her voice fierce. "James fought for Usher and overseas. If we can't fight for him, what kind of town are we?" Sarah and Ryan echoed her, their words a chorus of support. The grizzled veteran from the VFW stepped forward, his voice gravelly but clear. "I've seen enough hate in my life," he said. "James is one of us. Always will be." The crowd's mood shifted, applause breaking out, tentative at first, then stronger. Ray's face twisted, but his allies were fewer now, their resolve crumbling. Then, in a moment that stunned everyone, Ryan stepped to the podium, his dress blues gleaming. He turned to James and saluted, crisp and deliberate. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, his voice ringing. "You're the best of us. The crowd erupted, cheers drowning out Ray's protests. Tears stung James's eyes as he returned the salute, his heart full. Ray, defeated, turned and walked away, his followers trailing. The square buzzed with new energy. Neighbors approaching James with apologies, handshakes, even hugs. It wasn't a full victory, some would never accept him, but it was a start. Evan pulled him close, whispering, "You did it." James shook his head. "We did it." As the crowd dispersed, James looked at the oak tree, its branches heavy with history. He thought of his father, of the love that had protected him all those years ago. He thought of Evan, Sarah, Ryan, Emily, the family he'd chosen and the one that had chosen him back. Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was home. And for the first time, James felt he belonged. They stayed in town a few more days, helping Sarah and Ryan settle into their new life, talking with neighbors, planting seeds of change. When they finally drove back to Nashville, the hills of Tennessee stretched behind them, a reminder of what they'd fought for. James glanced at Evan, his partner, his home, and smiled. "We're going to be okay," he said. And for the first time in years, he believed it.